The world stands on the brink of many upheavals as traditional diplomatic rules and theories of international relations seem to have lost their meaning. The Middle East conflict among the United States, Israel, and Iran has brought everything to a head, drawing the world's full attention. At the center of that attention is the most unpredictable president in American history, Donald Trump. During his first term and the early years of his second term, we have repeatedly witnessed this infamous president unleash shocking statements. From this, analysts may wonder whether Donald Trump is truly an impulsive man who frequently loses control, or whether it is all merely a carefully calculated psychological warfare move. The following article analyzes Trump's shocking actions through game theory and the Madman theory to decode his behavior and the reality unfolding. Is he really a masterful architect leveraging chaos to reset a new world order for America, or just a reckless puppet being manipulated by hidden forces? All will be answered in the sections that follow. Part 1. The Madman in the Oval Office. In the Israel-US-Iran conflict, the world faces a variable no model can predict with complete accuracy. That variable is Donald Trump, a president who, in the eyes of many, aligns with China while leading the most powerful military power in history and is willing to issue threats no one expects. He used profane language in a post on Truth Social, labeling the Iranian leader a crazy wretch, ending with the phrase, "Praise be to," which is both provocative and mocking, and a bizarre psychological warfare move so extreme that it leaves people unsure whether to be angry or afraid. And all this happened on Easter Sunday morning as Pope Leo XIV stood on the balcony of the Temple of Fo, calling for everyone to lay down their arms. How did the world react to this information? Democratic Senator Chris Murphy called Trump completely out of control. Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of Trump's most loyal allies in Congress, called the peace crazy. The Iranian representative at the UN. The United Nations declares that the international community has a legal obligation to prevent such war crimes. 1 month into the war, and this is what has happened. To understand why the post above is not mere bravado, but part of a larger pattern, we need to review the recent period. On May 28, 2026, the United States and Israel jointly launched the epic Fury campaign, with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei killed in the initial airstrike. Military infrastructure, the headquarters of national security, and nuclear facilities were struck simultaneously. Overall, it was a textbook decapitation campaign. But war sometimes does not stop there. Iran retaliated by closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil and LNG shipments pass. Iranian ballistic missiles targeted U.S. bases at Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. The Brent crude price rose above $126 a barrel, the highest level since the 1970s energy crisis. Gas prices in the United States climbed above $6 per gallon. Urea fertilizer prices surged by 50%. European airports began restricting fuel supplies, and many places around the world were heavily affected. The campaign's cost was estimated at roughly $11.3 billion per week. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Heath requested an additional $200 billion in funding. Public opinion in the United States was strongly opposed. Polls showed that a majority of Americans did not support the war. On a day in May 2026, a U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down in Iranian airspace. The pilot was rescued immediately, but the weapons officer, a colonel, hid to avoid the IRGC and before U.S. Special Forces could mount a large-scale rescue operation with dozens of aircraft. 3 rescue aircraft were shot down by Iranian air defenses, including an A-10 Warthog that had to fly to the extraction point before the pilot could eject. Iran announced it had destroyed 2 U.S. C-130 transport aircraft in the operation, each valued at $250 to $300 million. The United States confirmed it had destroyed its own equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. This is not a war the White House is winning as they claim. The Power Plant Day paradox. And in that context, Trump posted about Power Plant Day. This isn't the first time he has threatened to strike civilian infrastructure. Earlier, the United States conducted airstrikes on Iran's largest bridge, and Trump shared a video. The online fallout was treated as a victory. The Pentagon described it as the destruction of the military supply line for Iran's ballistic missile forces and an offensive trolling campaign against Iran. But a bridge is still a bridge, and civilians use it to go to work, shop, and take their children to school. When the Wall Street Journal asked Trump whether he worried about the impact on ordinary Iranians from destroying the power plant and the bridge, he said no. They want us to do it. And they're living in hell. Such a response reveals a complete lack of humanity. Or perhaps it's a cold calculation that ordinary Iranians are bargaining chips, or both. In any case, this language violates, at least in spirit if not in word, the Geneva Conventions on the Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict. Crazy or strategic genius? This is the central question we must ask. Perhaps, reading the news in recent days, anyone's natural reaction would be to call him crazy. An American president who swears, insults, and threatens to destroy civilian infrastructure. No diplomat, no international relations textbook prepared us for a reality like this. But if we step back and frame these seemingly irrational actions within an analytic lens, a different story gradually emerges. Just a few hours after the tirade, Trump told Fox News that there would be a good chance of reaching a deal with Iran. He said the negotiations were going well, but you never reach the finish line with Iran. In other words, the same person on the same day, both threatening to attack everything and hinting at peace negotiations. Crazy, or is that the strategy? In game theory, there is a concept called a commitment device. You place yourself in a no-retreat position to make the other side believe your threat is real. Trump publicly sets a deadline. He uses language so extreme that it cannot be withdrawn. He makes himself a hostage to his own words. In the eyes of some analysts, this is the crucial point. If Trump does not act, he loses credibility. If he acts, Iran bears the consequences. Either path pressures Iran to respond. These are not meant to defend Trump. They are offered to understand Trump through game theory and logic. Of the empire's decline. This analytical framework is not set up to turn chaos into order, but to see what percentage is calculated and what percentage is truly mad. The piece references parts of Professor Chang's game theory lecture number 18 on the Trump world order, but it does not wholly follow his argument. Chang presents a fairly intriguing guiding framework, and I will present it fairly, but he also tends to over-rationalize, turning every action by Trump into a component of a grand plan. The reality is more complex. Sometimes a piece that curses on Truth Social and on Easter Sunday morning, in essence, is simply a curse posted on Truth Social and Easter morning. I want to maintain a neutral perspective, but I do not shy away from judging America's madman. Neutrality does not mean silent denial of irrationality. It means analyzing irrationality with the sharpest tool at hand. And that tool, in this case, is game theory. Part 2. Madman theory from Nixon to Trump. When the strongest man loses his mind. Madman theory. The theory of the madman was first publicly described by H.R. Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff, in his memoir The Power, published in 1978. According to Haldeman, in the summer of 1968, when he was still a presidential candidate, Nixon told him, "I call it madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe that I have reached the point where I could do anything to end the war. We just have to let out that, good heavens, Nixon is obsessed with the communists. We cannot restrain him when he is angry and his hand is on the nuclear button. Then Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris in 2 days, kneeling to beg for peace." When the book came out, few scholars valued it. Many people thought Haldeman had just come out of prison because of Watergate, calling the old boss a madman. But nearly half a century later, through thousands of pages of declassified documents, jurists have shown that madman theory is not a myth. It was the core instrument of Nixon in the Cold War, the nuclear alert that the world did not know about. In October 1969, Nixon secretly ordered the JCS readiness test, a global military alert lasting from October 13th to 30th. Strategic bombers armed with nuclear warheads were deployed. Missile submarines. Ballistic missiles moved to combat positions. Aircraft carriers were deployed across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Sea of Japan. The entire U.S. nuclear command and control system was put on standby. The aim of this was not to prepare for war, but to send a signal to Moscow. Nixon had lost control and anything could happen. The result was a mess. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko later admitted that Nixon put forces on standby too many times, making it hard to tell what was real and what was bluff. But this is the key point. No one could figure out what Nixon was trying to convey. The signal was completely garbled, and everyone knows how the Vietnam War unfolded. And, of course, it did not unfold the way the United States intended. Many scholars later called the Madman theory ineffective and dangerous. Not only because it failed in some events, but also because the escalation of military activity created a serious risk of a nuclear accident. The details above serve as evidence that the Madman theory fails, according to some perspectives. Why would the madman have the upper hand? Imagine a game where two cars race toward each other. Whoever swerves first loses. If both are rational, the outcome is predictable because they will seek a compromise. However, if one side believes the other driver is crazy or has lost control, the rational side will be forced to yield. Because in a confrontation, the one who does not fear death has the absolute advantage. It might seem insane, but that can be an effective way to force the opponent to back down. Thomas Schelling, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005, expanded this idea in The Strategy of Conflict with the notion that bargaining through self-imposed commitments and irrevocable commitments creates pressure on the opponent. If the opponent believes you will actually carry out the threat, even if it harms you, they must concede. In a world of mutual assured destruction, a rational leader who threatens to escalate will be rejected by the opponent because both sides know it would be suicide. However, for an irrational leader, his threat suddenly seems credible. This is the paradox. In a world where rationality is the norm, madness becomes a weapon. But the madman theory has a deadly flaw. The madman cannot guarantee to the opponent that, if they concede, they will not be punished further. In other words, if I think you are a madman, I am not only afraid you will attack when I resist, I am afraid you will attack even when I surrender. Unpredictability is both a weapon and a double-edged blade that erodes the credibility of the one who wields it. Donald Trump, Mad Maury, the unscripted version. The fundamental difference between Nixon and Trump lies here. Nixon needed to perform. Trump does not. Nixon was a lawyer, a cold-blooded strategist. Madman theory is a role. He stays lucid behind the mask of madness. That is a controlled script. As for Trump, he does not need to perform. This is both his strength and his deadly flaw. Look at the following actions. In June 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer, 12 days of airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facility, and then he declared that now was the time for peace. In January 2026, kidnapping the president of Venezuela, an act of international law violation that no one believed possible. Even America's allies were stunned. In Q1 of 202, he threatened to annex Greenland, provoked Canada, renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, imposed a 50% tariff on Colombia, and pressed diplomatic pressure on Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua. In February 2026, he launched Operation Epic Fury to kill Khomeini while nuclear negotiations were taking place in Geneva. In May 2026, he declared NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Australia to be useless allies. America doesn't need anyone. In April 2002, he threatened to destroy Iran's power plant and civilian bridges on Easter Sunday morning. If you present this sequence of actions to a first-year international relations student, they would call him a madman. But in game theory terms, this is an Oscar-winning actor acting with a consistent inconsistency. Each action is surprising, each threat is backed by real deeds, and each crisis ends with Trump in a better bargaining position, or at least not worse. Trump uses Madman theory not only as a tool of intimidation, but as an operating instinct when he ordered the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. That was an action no expert anticipated. Killing a senior official of another state could risk triggering a full-scale war. However, Iran responded with limited retaliation, and Trump regarded it as a victory. When he kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro, no one thought that it would happen. It was feasible, but it happened. Each time the madman acted and the world didn't collapse, his standing grew another notch. Each time the opponent failed to respond forcefully enough, Trump confirmed that his tactic was working. And this was precisely the premise that convinced the White House epic fury would succeed. They expected Iran to react with limits, as it had to the Soleimani and Midnight Hammer events. According to Time, the Trump administration believed that an overwhelming initial strike would provoke Tehran's only feasible response, a limited retaliation. However, they were wrong. The opponent proved no less determined. The man theory collapsed when the opponent also chose not to back down. Iran is a country of 88 million, with the IRGC's decentralized decision-making mechanism designed to survive high-profile assassinations. CNN, citing Iranian experts, said the regime had dispersed power in advance to ensure it could endure after senior assassinations. Khamenei dies, but the IRGC still controls, and Iran also has one crucial asset, the Strait of Hormuz. They only need to close the strait and 20% of the world's oil would stop flowing. That would be the global economic weapon. Iran knows that every day Hormuz remains closed, the economic pressure on Trump increases. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf responded to Trump's threats by declaring, "Our soldiers are waiting for the day the Americans set foot on the ground to burn them." Iran also stated that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen only if the US agrees to compensate for damages. In other words, they are not just fearless, they're the ones setting the price. This is something the theory cannot resolve when the opponent believes their survival is at stake and they have nothing left to lose. All rational calculations are moot. The madman meets the daredevil and no one can steer. But wait, if Iran is considered to be at its weakest moment in history, why would they dare such a gamble? Indeed, early 2026 is an extraordinarily favorable moment for the US to attack Iran, perhaps the most favorable in history. The axis of resistance has been crippled, limb by limb. Hamas pinned in Gaza, Hezbollah has lost dozens of commanders in Lebanon, Assad's regime collapsed in Syria, militant groups in Iraq weakened. Inside Iran, waves of protests at the end of 2025 and into early 2026 erupted across the country and were brutally suppressed. Inflation surpassed 60%. The real collapsed. Air defenses have been severely weakened since Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. If the madman theory rests on the premise that the opponent will fear and yield, this should have been the moment that premise reached its peak. Iran is in the weakest position. They should have been the side to steer the confrontation. The likelihood of Iran dying for the cause has never been lower, and precisely for that reason Trump dared to act. The madman theory is not a reckless tactic. It only works when the user believes the opponent is rational enough to fear it. Looking at Iran in early 2026, internal turmoil, exhaustion, loss of allies, Trump concludes that this is prey that will not resist. Each time the US has attacked in the past, Iran swallowed bitterly and withdrew. But this is precisely the moment when the logic of the madman theory betrays its user. Because there is a threshold in game theory called the breakout point, where weakness itself becomes a source of strength. When Iran is strong, they can concede without losing face. But when Iran is cornered, they no longer negotiate to keep peace. They fight to survive. And a country fighting for its survival does not follow any rational logic. They do not calculate according to cost-benefit logic. They close the Strait of Hormuz even though they know the world economy will be heavily affected. They attack American bases in the Middle East because they have nothing left to lose. They demand compensation not because they expect to receive it, but to tell the world, we do not seek peace, we are setting terms. Trump uses the theory to pressure Iran when Iran is weakest, But he forgets that a madman cannot scare a reckless opponent who is cornered. The Madman Theory and Scholarly Research. Research from the Fur Center titled MMA, OM Genus used 5 large-scale survey experiments and reached notable conclusions. The madman theory can intimidate an opponent in the short term, but it undermines domestic credibility, and domestic credibility is what you need to sustain a long-running war. Research by James Du Bois in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs directly compares Nixon and Trump and concludes that both used indeterminacy as a diplomatic tool. But Trump lacks the mechanism of control that Nixon had, because Nixon also had Kissinger as a rational counterweight that made the tactic fundamentally more dangerous. And most importantly, the scholars. Leaders who wield madman theory, Nixon, Khrushchev, Saddam Hussein, Donald Trump, Gaddafi, have all failed in coercive power struggles. Not every madman wins. In fact, history shows that madmen often lose. They rarely pay the price alone. Can a madman control the game? Let's recap before moving on. Madman theory explains why Trump acts crazy in a consistent pattern from Greenland to Venezuela to Iran. It reveals a logic that creates deterrence, raises the cost of concessions for the opponent, and exploits fear. Madman theory cannot explain why even Trump's own allies are bewildered. It does not explain why Iran, instead of fearing and conceding, escalates and demands compensation. And it does not explain why, if this is a master plan, those involved would need to warn Trump that he is losing in domestic public opinion. There is one opening I want to propose. Trump is not a madman with a plan, nor purely a madman. He is a person with an extraordinarily strong instinct for power, acting in the pattern of madman theory rather than as someone who reads, studies, and applies these theories. Perhaps his personal temperament merely aligns with the model, and when instinct coincides with theory, the result can look like genius until it no longer does. Nixon called his tactic madman theory because he knew he wasn't crazy. Trump probably would never use that term, not because he is more cautious, but because he sees no need to justify anything. And that may be the scariest part. Part 3. If the madman is actually a genius. And now for the most interesting part. Put aside social media posts, forget street slang, and ask, if Trump wants all this to happen, what then? As Professor Yang analyzed, wars in the Middle East would disrupt the region's abundant oil wealth from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the UAE, and Kuwait, but wealth is not as plentiful as people think. Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves. Canada ranks 4th, and the United States is the leading producer. If the Middle East were erased from the map, the world would have to rely on North America and Russia. And let's see who controls North America. Trump has intervened in Venezuela for months. He has sent signals to Greenland as a warning to Canada. All of it is in place. In the expanded North American strategy that Defense Secretary Peter Hacks calls Greater North America, the United States is currently carrying about $39 trillion in public debt. The holders of this debt include Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Europe. And those who stand to lose the most are precisely them. When the Middle East is sidelined, these countries are forced to buy oil from North America, and to do so they need USD. To obtain USD, they continue buying US treasuries. Suddenly, the fear of stopping bond purchases, the fear of de-dollarization, disappears. The dollar's strength is secured not by economic power, but by enforced dependence. According to Professor Yang's argument, Trump did not invent this strategy. Putin demonstrated it in the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not only about NATO expansion, but to implement the vision from Alexander Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics. The decline of the West is inevitable, and Russia must build a self-sufficient fortress to weather the storm. The war in Ukraine enables Russia to reindustrialize its economy around defense production, ignite a boom in domestic drone manufacturing, and dominate the war economy. And most importantly, by controlling Ukraine, Russia controls 1/3 of the world's wheat production and a share of Europe's energy supplies. Trump saw this and said the US could do the same. Part 2. Reordering the World Order. On November 11th, 1991, President George H.W. Bush proclaimed a new world order built on three pillars: the United States as the center of global finance, secular multiculturalism, and Pax Americana, with the United States guaranteeing global security. The world order under Donald Trump stood in opposition to each of these pillars. Instead of financialization, he pursued a return to resources and production. Instead of multiculturalism, Trump embraced Christian nationalism. Instead of defending the world, the infamous president withdrew to North America and left the world to fend for itself. Make America Great Again, in this sense, is not merely a campaign slogan, it is a geopolitical doctrine. The boldest thesis from Professor Yang is that Trump understood the system was in decline and was actively steering that decline. America has become a lazy, indebted, and corrupt society, Trang argues. Inequality begets a centralized power structure. This, in turn, breeds anger, and that anger gives rise to Trump. Within this framework, the Iran war is not a mistake but a catalyst. By weakening the global economy, Trump is forcing the world to rely on North America, helping the United States shift from a financial economy to one based on productive resources, and weaving war into the mix to rally domestic opinion around nationalism. Part 5. Do not idolize the madman. All analyses of the madman theory, the energy chessboard, and the world order under Trump seem coherent and clear. However, that is the problem. The most dangerous trap when analyzing a figure like Trump is not underestimating him, but overestimating him, seeing the chaos and imagining a master plan behind it. The reality could be much simpler. Trump is not the architect. Trump is a product of forces stronger, smarter, and more patient than he is. The puppet hypothesis. Let's start with a simple question. Does Trump read books? This is not a contemptuous rhetorical question. It's a methodological one. The madman theory requires broad, research-based knowledge. But everyone close to Trump confirms that he does not read texts longer than a page. He shows little interest in theory, and his decisions are mainly driven by instinct and by the last person who spoke to him. And if Trump isn't the brain behind the strategy, then who is? Tier 1. Netanyahu and Israel. Stephen Walt, a Harvard professor and co-author of the Israel Lobby, wrote a sharp analysis in Foreign Policy indicating that the Iran war bears more of Israel's imprint than America's. The evidence he presents is very specific. Foreign Minister Marco Rubio admits the United States knew Israel would attack, predicted Iran would retaliate against U.S. forces in the region, and thus chose a preemptive strike. Prime Minister Netanyahu pressed for war for months. He persuaded the United States to bomb Iran's nuclear facility in June 2025 and called Trump on 2026 to announce the location of the upcoming meeting with Iran's leader Khamenei. Information from intelligence leading to the opening strike, epic fury. Looking into Trump's inner circle, two Middle East emissaries, Steve Koff and Jar Nur, are both strong supporters of Israel. The U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Habby, believes Israel is the Holy Land. Rubio, serving as foreign minister and national security advisor, was one of the senators who received the most funding. From Israel, Suji W.S., a former White House advisor who previously worked on Netanyahu's 2020 re-election campaign. On the financial side, Trump also acknowledged it in a speech before Congress in October 2025. He specifically mentioned Miriam Adelson, the wife of Sean Adelson, the single largest individual donor in recent U.S. election history. Ironically, Trump himself had tweeted in 2015 about his rival Rubio that Sharon Addison was trying to pour money into Rubio because he believed he could mold Rubio into a perfect puppet. I agree. Now Rubio is Trump's Secretary of State and Miriam Adelson is Trump's biggest donor. Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned over the Iran war, writing in a letter to Trump, "Iran does not pose an urgent threat to our country, and clearly we started this war due to pressure and Israel's lobbying in the US. The second layer, evangelical believers and the apocalyptic war. This is the layer that few people pay attention to." The Intercept has just released a lengthy investigation showing that Trump is surrounded by evangelical advisors. They believe the Iran war is part of an end-times plan. Paulo I, head of the White House Faith Office, asked Prime Minister Netanyahu in an interview whether the world was ready to unleash the final battle. She explains the current war through the lens of dispensationalism, the doctrine of the end times, a branch of evangelical theology that reads the Bible literally and believes the conflict in the Middle East is a prophetic sign of the end times. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has also organized prayer meetings in the military, elevating evangelical figures to senior positions and integrating a Christian worldview into military culture. For these people, the Iran war is a divine command. By framing the war as a sacred crusade, they render ending the war nearly impossible because you do not negotiate with the will of God. The third layer, Silicon Valley and the war economy. The Washington Post recently reported on the Hen Valley Forum, where venture capitalists and Trump officials celebrated the shift in defense spending from traditional contractors to a new generation of tech companies such as Anduril, SHAI, Skidio, and, of course, SpaceX. Mark Anderson, co-founder. The Anderson Horowitz Investment Fund has repeatedly appeared at Mar-a-Lago throughout the transfer of power, recruiting and interviewing candidates for senior White House positions. His fund directly invests in high-tech military companies. Pirate co-founded PayPal and the data intelligence firm Pentair. Although he holds no official title, he maintains a direct line to the president and to Vice President JDB. David Sachs, the All-In podcast host famed in the tech world, who serves as Trump's AI and crypto advisor. The Iran war is not only a geopolitical struggle, it is an economic one. The top 15 American billionaires added nearly $1 trillion to their wealth in Trump's first year of a second term. Oil prices rose 80% in 2026, and the main beneficiaries were American energy companies, the interests that Trump serves. A grand plan or a chain of coincidence? Professor Young builds a world order framework around Trump's system based on a key assumption. Trump acts according to a deliberate plan, tearing down the old order to construct a North American fortress of self-reliance. But there is another possibility worth serious consideration. Trump has no plan. Everything is instinct. A powerful instinct for power, a politically acute survival instinct, and an instinct to serve the man who elevated him. Yet instinct is not strategy. Instinct explains why Trump consistently makes shocking moves, because he knows attention is the only thing he truly understands. He does not plan for tomorrow. He reacts to what is in front of him. From this perspective, what looks like a grand plan may simply be the unintended result of a series of short-term reactions. Each reaction serves a different interest group at different moments. Each action serves someone's interests, but that does not necessarily mean someone is orchestrating the whole. Going to war is the president's decision, and he alone bears responsibility, but no president acts entirely alone, even if Trump wants us to believe otherwise. In other words, what looks like madman theory may merely be a man without a moral compass, dragged by multiple forces at once, and because those forces intersect, the outcome appears coherent. But when the forces diverge, vie. Although Silicon Valley wants to end the war because the market has deteriorated, while other parties want to continue, the plan will fall apart. The losses are real. Whether Trump is a genius or a puppet, one unchanging reality remains: the dead do not care about complex theories. The airstrikes by the United States and Israel have destroyed schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites in Iran. As we sit here analyzing theoretical frameworks, remember that every move on the political chessboard corresponds to families who have lost loved ones. Game theory can explain motives, but it does not justify war crimes. When we say Trump could be a genius, we are either inadvertently or deliberately rationalizing a war whose costs are paid in the blood of others. Part 7. Living with a Madman. Is Donald Trump a madman or a strategic genius hidden behind a chaotic veneer? The most honest answer is probably both and neither entirely. Madman theory provides a cognitive framework for understanding why chaos can be a tool. Game theory shows that in the global geopolitical chessboard, the mad end may have an edge that rational actors do not. But history also teaches that Madman theory has never truly won. It only changes the way the world unravels. The Iran War of 2026 is not over yet. The world still trembles, and that madman continues to post regularly on social media. The only certainty is that whether Trump is mad or a genius, the world will never return to what it was. The question is not whether we will accept a new order, but where we will stand within it. I hope you enjoy this video.